farms in Iowa and why it affects transparency and equity?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the reasons that we decided to campaign against factory farms in Iowa is that every 4 years, it's a great platform to talk about what's wrong with our food system and why we should ban factory farms. So we actually sent to all the presidential candidates a survey, and the 5 of them came back and said that they support a moratorium. Well, we have been hounding them as they've been on the campaign trail, and Iowa is a very important state to talk about factory farms because it's the #1 producer of hogs. 48 million hogs in 2018. And what's happened to Iowa is the sad story of rural America, where we once had diversified farms where farmers grew some animals, they grew some crops, some vegetables. That has been replaced now by giant factory farms with, in the case of chickens, hundreds of thousands of chickens in a warehouse. In the case of hogs, about 5,000 per factory farm. And so we see Iowa as a place that these candidates can really see what's happening with our food system. And really the only way that we're going to bring these issues to the presidential debate is really to go out there and force the candidates to talk about it, which is a big job. But it's more than just starting the debate with the presidential candidates. We also see that we've failed in federal policy to deal with factory farms. The Environmental Protection Agency has been a terrible disappointment, and I'm sad to say that that's long before the Trump administration came to office. EPA doesn't even know how many factory farms there are in the United States. They have failed to use our very good environmental laws like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, to really rein in all of this waste. And let's talk about the waste.
Yeah, let's talk about the connection between factory farms. Not only everyone knows about like animal cruelty, everyone's worried about that, but what about water? What about our health?
Right, well, when you have huge amounts of waste that's going into waterways, so I'm going to use Iowa as an example because just this week the Department of Natural Resources came out with their 2-year assessment of the state of water quality in Iowa. There were 813 violations of water quality in 622 waterways. Now that's because there are, hate to use all these big numbers, but it's the only way to talk about it, 287 million pounds of animal waste from factory farms in Iowa. Now that's half as much as the human waste that's produced in the state, but let's think about human waste. That either goes to a wastewater facility and is cleaned up, or there are very strict rules in rural areas for septic systems. Well, not so with animal waste. It is kept in lagoons in many, many states because EPA has pushed the authority to deal with the waste onto states, and every state does it differently, but none of them do it very well. So in Iowa, it's stored in lagoons and then hosed into fields where it's spread. Now we all know that to grow crops you need fertilizer, but a state like Iowa doesn't need all of these tons of manure going onto fields. So that all ends up in our water. So other states deal with the waste in an even worse way. North Carolina is a good example. It's a excellent example of the lack of equity in the way that factory farms are dealt with. Most of the pig farms in North Carolina are in a corner of the state, the southeastern corner of the state. It's been horribly hit by hurricanes, which has spread the waste and the dead hogs throughout waterways. And these pig farms are located in African American communities. The waste is not just stored in these huge lagoons, but it's actually sprayed in the air on fields. The people who live near these factory farms are sick because of the ammonia and all of the other contaminants that are in the waste. And there's a very high incident of asthma. So factory farms are located in communities where there's a lack of equity, economic equity, racial and ethnic diversity. And also, when you look at the whole system, these factory farms mean that there have to be many new slaughter plants. So the slaughter plants depend on immigrants who are actually afraid that they're going to be deported if they complain about the working conditions. And working in a slaughter plant, because the slaughter lines move so quickly, about 1,300 hogs an hour in a pig slaughter plant. So there are lots and lots of injuries. And then you have the immigrants also working on the factory farms with very little regulation. And when there is an injury, very little is done about it. I mean, there was a case recently where 2 immigrants drowned in a lagoon in Oregon. This was a dairy factory farm. And they were fined $5,000, the company. So, you know, we must change the way that we're producing animals. This is an unsustainable system. As was mentioned earlier, it's also driving climate change. And we just can't afford to raise animals in this fashion anymore. So we have to change policy at many levels, though. At the state level, and one of the reasons we're working at the state level is because if you can change things in enough states, you can help drive federal policy. But we also can't forget that we need federal policies and that we need to do a lot of the consciousness raising and education about why we have factory farms and how we're going to change the system.
Absolutely. Another related issue that you kind of touched upon with regulation, with inspection, is this issue of privatized meat inspection. It's in only 2 of the presidential candidates' platforms. What is the state of meat inspection, and what is Food and Water Watch doing in response?
Well, we have been fighting privatized meat inspection for we're almost 15 years old, and that's one of the issues that we started working on the first month that we started. We saw privatization start in poultry. Today in privatized plants, you may see a slaughter line kill between 140 and 175 chickens. Now, the reason that the industry wants to privatize and get the meat inspectors out of slaughter facilities is the lines can't move as quickly if there are USDA inspectors in the way, so to speak. So the thrust is to let the meat industry actually regulate themselves. We were pleased to see a New York Times editorial this year, earlier this year, saying that privatized meat inspection probably isn't such a good idea. And we've just seen that rather than making sure that slaughter is done in a way that people's health is protected, that the industry is using lots of chemical washes to get rid of the E. coli and the other bacteria. Trisodium phosphate, ammonia, poultry especially is actually dipped often twice in these solutions to kill all of the bacteria. You'll notice if you eat commercial chicken that it's very wet when it comes out of the package. There's a reason for that.
Right.
And actually I should say that the industry is now going to pressure, and probably the Trump administration is going to capitulate or probably cooperate because they believe in it, with hog privatization. And in fact, we're getting ready to sue when this announcement is made.
Excellent. Can you tell me a little bit about what that process is like? I know that you guys have outstanding litigation right now. Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, well, the way that we look at policy is that you have to use every tactic in your toolkit. So one of the things that we do is use litigation in states and on issues that we're working on. So we have litigation right now focused on food in a number of areas. The Farm Service Administration, which is part of USDA, has been giving taxpayer dollars to factory farms for supposedly having good conservation methods. Actually, this is not the case. So we're suing FSA and forcing them to actually do environmental assessments before they hand out these dollars. We're suing the state of Delaware to try to get them to toughen up their monitoring of waste discharges. What happens in most states is that the waste is just discharged. The Clean Water Act is not being actually followed. There are all sorts of exemptions. And so we're trying to have a lawsuit that changes federal law that we can use in other states. Pennsylvania, we have a lawsuit trying to restore communities' right to pass ordinances to stop the spraying of manure or to keep out factory farms. It's called local control. And in Iowa, where we have a big legislative campaign that you mentioned earlier, trying to pass a moratorium on the expansion of CAFOs, we're suing the state over their failure to, they're violating the public trust to protect the Raccoon River, which is the source of drinking water for 500,000 Americans. So those are some of the ways that you can use the law. It's usually not a silver bullet, but it helps in these larger campaigns.
Wow, thank you so much. Let's move on to our Q&A. Any questions? Do you have a